Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kahl, I understand that on August the 18th, the Consul General in Kabul sent the following email to his team. I'm going to quote it for you. Quoting now, President Biden phoned Ambassador Wilson with the following directive about who to clear to board the evacuation flights. Number one, anyone with a valid form of ID should be given permission to go on a plane if that person plausibly falls into the categories we will evacuate. U.S. citizens and LPRs plus their immediate families, LES plus their immediate families, those entitled to an SIV, and Afghans at risk. Number two, families, including women and children, should be allowed through and held to fill out the planes. Number three, total inflow to the United States must exceed the number of seats available, err on the side of excess. I'm still quoting, this guidance provides clear discretion and direction to fill seats and provides special consideration for women and children when we have seats. I expect that C-17 flight volume will increase, end quote. Are you aware of any guidance from the White House to evacuate Afghans who might plausibly fill out these categories, to fill seats regardless of whether the passengers actually were eligible or not, and to err on the side of excess? Are you familiar with this directive?
So our priorities, so I can't speak to that specific engagement, but our priorities in that time frame were, as you mentioned, first and foremost, American citizens and legal permanent residents, green card holders, also locally employed staff of the State Department, but also other agencies and departments, SIVs, and others with documents. But it was also the case that as we were bringing forces in, we had excess capacity to bring people out. And so what the president was signaling was, if there are other clearly Afghans at risk that we can safely bring into the airport and get off the airfield, we should do that.
Well, but that's not what the email says. The email doesn't say clearly. It says plausibly. It says that the flights need to be filled out. It says that we need to err on the side of excess. I mean, what I'm driving at is we now know that we've got major problems with vetting of the people who were brought to this country, who were evacuated and brought to this country. This email seems to indicate that the administration was saying, just fill up the planes. I mean, if they plausibly fall into a category, put them on a plane. Is that wrong? Is that incorrect?
So vetting was always foremost in our mind, but just keep in mind, Senator, the vetting wasn't happening at HKIA.
Where did the vetting happen?
So all the vetting happened at what we called the lily pads. So these were...
And the vetting consisted of what?
Yeah. So in places like Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Ramstein, and elsewhere, essentially teams of DHS, CBP, DOD would collect biometric information, fingerprints, et cetera, biographic information, and then that information would be fed through the NCTC, CBP, and FBI databases. And only people who had cleared that vetting so that they didn't have contacts with the Taliban or the Haqqanis or Al-Qaeda or ISIS were to be manifested to be brought to the United States. And people who required further processing were not brought to the United States.
Was there ever any in-person vetting done?
Well, all this was in person in the lily pad.
Well, those aren't interviews. That's a scan. That's just fingerprinting. So, were there ever any in person? That's a screening. Was there actually any vetting done where you sit down and you ask the person questions?
So, it's a good question. For those where there was either there wasn't sufficient information or there was derogatory information. Now, keep in mind, the derogatory information could be that you shared the same name with somebody, or that your phone number touched a phone number of a phone number. For people where there was any derogatory information, then yes, follow-up interviews and additional vetting was done.
At the lily pads?
Yes.
And in the United States too, or just at the lily pads?
There may have been instances in which people came to the United States who also received additional vetting, but I would direct you to the DHS to get the full counting of that.
Oh, I'm talking to DHS, believe me. And what's interesting is what DHS says is there was never any in-person vetting done anywhere. Not at the lily pads, not in the United States. Your testimony here today under oath is there was in-person vetting done, that you sat down and did interviews with them. Is that right? I just want to be clear on this.
So my understanding is that at the lily pads, so forward,
right,
Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, et cetera, that those who popped derogatory information, if they couldn't be cleared because it was some misunderstanding, so for the example of someone with the same name.
Right.
If it required further investigation, there were times where the FBI spoke to those individuals.
So you testified in September that those evacuated, about 6,000 American citizens. You testified in September that the SIVs were about 1,200 or 1,300. That leaves 116,700 people based on the 124,000 NEO number that you've been offering. 116,700 people who were not citizens, who were not SIVs, and we just don't know much about. Who were those people?
Yeah. So just so we all are working off the same set of numbers. So we evacuated around 2,000 U.S. Embassy personnel. We evacuated 5,530 American citizens. We evacuated 3,335 third country nationals. So think of that as, somebody who worked for another embassy, not an Afghan. We evacuated during the NEO 2,496 SIV holders. And then we evacuated 64,052 other Afghans at risk. Some of those were on our P2 or P1 or P2 refugee rolls, and others were, some of those were, I know every office on Capitol Hill was calling to try to get people out, whether they had a formal relationship or not. It might have been because they had a relationship with an organization like NDI or, some other NGO. We also got out 2,004 NATO citizens, and we facilitated 44,874 people coming out on non-U.S. aircraft by other folks. So it's a mixed mash of a lot of different categories. About 84% of the people we brought out were Afghans at risk of various kinds, SIVs, P1s, P2s, or others.
My time has expired, and the chairman's been very indulgent. I'll have a number of questions for you for the record.
Take those for the record.
Dr. Kahl, there's a lot to sort through here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.